about Donald Trump's unjustified tariffs on Canada. This is an attack on our country and on British Columbia families that will not go unanswered. The tension between the United States and Canada has reached a boiling point, with British Columbia Premier David Eby taking aggressive action against the U.S. in response to President Donald Trump's tariffs on Canadian goods. The latest move? Proposing tolls on commercial trucks traveling from the continental U.S. to Alaska through British Columbia. This bold strategy targets Alaska's reliance on Canadian infrastructure, turning geography into a weapon in an escalating trade war. Alaska, though legally part of the United States, is physically isolated from the lower 48. There are no direct roads, railways, or pipelines connecting it to the mainland without crossing Canadian territory. Every shipment of groceries, fuel, or construction materials must pass through British Columbia and the Yukon, making Alaska uniquely vulnerable to Canadian policy shifts. Premier Eby's proposal to impose tolls on these shipments is not just a retaliatory measure, it's a calculated strike at a critical pressure point. The tolls would raise shipping costs by thousands of dollars per load, costs that would inevitably be passed on to Alaskan consumers already burdened with some of the highest living expenses in North America. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel with the bell notification turned on for more videos. The Alaska Highway, a 1,387-mile lifeline built during World War II, is at the center of the dispute. A 1977 treaty between the United States and Canada explicitly prohibits tolls on this route, but EBE is testing the limits of that agreement. Trump has responded with fury, calling the move illegal and vowing retaliation. Behind the scenes, White House advisors are preparing legal countermeasures, including freezing infrastructure funds and reviewing cross-border treaties. The situation has devolved into a high-stakes game of chicken with neither side willing to back down. For Alaska, the consequences are dire. The state's economy depends on seamless access through Canada, and any disruption could lead to shortages of essential goods. Remote towns like Hyderabad, which rely entirely on Canadian roads for access, would be hit hardest. Residents are already stockpiling supplies, fearing the worst. The tolls are framed as temporary, but industry analysts warn they could become permanent if the trade war intensifies. The conflict has also spilled into maritime routes. Most ships bound for Alaska travel through Canadian waters, particularly the Inside Passage, a protected network of channels that cruise liners and cargo vessels rely on for safe travel. If Canada were to restrict access or impose new fees, shipping costs would skyrocket, and tourism, a vital sector for Alaska, would suffer. Even air travel is at risk as flights from the lower 48 to Alaska often depend on Canadian airspace. Denying overflight rights would force airlines to take longer, costlier routes, disrupting both passenger travel and cargo shipments. The standoff is more than a trade dispute, it's a clash of national pride. Trump has framed the issue as a matter of American sovereignty, while Eby has positioned himself as a defender of Canadian interests. The rhetoric has grown increasingly personal, with Trump dismissing Eby as a weak provincial bureaucrat, and Eby firing back with declarations of defiance. The longer the stalemate continues, the harder it becomes to find a diplomatic solution. Border communities caught in the middle are pleading for de-escalation. Mayors of towns like Skagway and Haines have sent joint letters to both governments, warning of the economic devastation that further retaliation would bring, but their voices are being drowned out by the larger geopolitical struggle. For now, Alaska's fate hangs in the balance, dependent on a web of routes that Canada could tighten or sever at any moment. The broader implications are equally troubling. If Canada succeeds in using Alaska as leverage, it could embolden other provinces to take similar actions, further straining U.S. Canada relations. Meanwhile, Trump's hardline approach risks alienating a key ally and destabilizing North American trade networks. The Alaska highway crisis is no longer just about tariffs or tolls. It's a test of how far both nations are willing to go in a battle where geography, pride, and power collide. As winter approaches, the urgency grows. Alaska's isolation makes it uniquely susceptible to supply chain disruptions, and the threat of shortages looms large. The question now is whether cooler heads will prevail, or if the conflict will spiral into a full-blown trade war, with Alaska paying the price. The Alaska highway crisis has escalated beyond a simple trade dispute, morphing into a geopolitical standoff with far-reaching consequences. As British Columbia's toll proposal looms, the ripple effects are being felt across industries, governments, and everyday lives on both sides of the border. The situation has exposed the fragility of Alaska's supply chains and the precarious nature of U.S.-Canada relations under the strain of aggressive trade policies. For Alaska, the immediate concern is survival. The state's reliance on Canadian infrastructure is not just a logistical reality, it's an economic lifeline. Trucking companies, already grappling with rising fuel costs and regulatory hurdles, now face the prospect of tolls that could make shipments to Alaska financially untenable. Smaller freight operators, unable to absorb the additional expenses, may be forced to abandon routes altogether, leaving remote communities without reliable access to essentials like food, medicine, and heating oil. The timing couldn't be worse. Winter in Alaska is harsh, and supply delays could turn dangerous if roads become impassable or shipments are held up at the border. The maritime industry is bracing for similar disruptions. The Inside Passage, a critical route for cargo and cruise ships, is under scrutiny as Canadian officials weigh retaliatory measures. New environmental regulations or fees could slow maritime traffic, driving up costs for goods transported by sea. Cruise lines, a cornerstone of Alaska's tourism economy, are already fielding cancellations as travelers fear itinerary changes or higher ticket prices. For coastal towns like Juneau and Ketchikan, where tourism dollars sustain local businesses, the stakes are existential. A downturn in visitor numbers could devastate economies that rely on seasonal influxes of tourists. Even the skies are no longer a safe haven. Overflight rights, long taken for granted, are now a bargaining chip in Canada's arsenal. If airspace restrictions are imposed, airlines would be forced to reroute flights over the Pacific or Arctic, adding hours to travel time and inflating costs. For Alaskans already accustomed to exorbitant airfare, this could make travel to the lower 48 prohibitively expensive. More critically, air cargo, which transports everything from fresh produce to medical supplies, would face delays and price hikes, further straining communities where alternatives are scarce. The human toll of this standoff is perhaps the most alarming. In border towns like Hyder, Alaska, which relies entirely on Canadian roads and services, residents are living in a state of uncertainty. The town's only access to emergency medical care, groceries, and fuel is through Stewart, British Columbia. If tolls or border restrictions are enforced, Hyder could become functionally cut off. Similar fears grip Skagway and Hannes, where cross-border commerce is woven into daily life. Local leaders have begged for compromise, but their pleas are drowned out by the political posturing of national figures. On the Canadian side, the calculus is equally complex. British Columbia's Premier David Eye is walking a tightrope between defending provincial interests and avoiding a full-blown trade war. While the tolls are framed as a proportional response to Trump's tariffs, they risk harming Canadian businesses that depend on cross-border trade. Trucking firms, port workers, and tourism operators in British Columbia and the Yukon would feel the pinch if shipments to Alaska slow or stop. The province's reputation as a reliable trade partner could also suffer, deterring future investment. Yet for many Canadians, the move is seen as a necessary pushback against what they view as American bullying. The legal battle over the 1977 treaty adds another layer of tension. Trump's administration insists the tolls would violate the agreement, while Canada argues the fees target new infrastructure not covered by the original terms. Legal scholars are divided, but the ambiguity leaves room for escalation. If the U.S. retaliates by freezing funding for highway maintenance or imposing counter-tariffs, Canada could respond with further restrictions, creating a vicious cycle of retaliation. The North American Free Trade Agreement's replacement, designed to prevent such disputes, is being tested like never before. Behind the scenes, diplomats are scrambling to de-escalate, but progress is slow. Trump's confrontational style and Eby's defiance have turned the conflict into a personal duel, with both leaders staking their political reputations on the outcome. Compromise is increasingly framed as weakness, leaving little room for negotiation. Meanwhile, Alaskans and border communities are left to wonder if their needs will be sacrificed in the name of political brinkmanship. The broader implications of this crisis extend far beyond Alaska. If Canada succeeds in leveraging geography to pressure the U.S., it could set a precedent for other nations to exploit similar vulnerabilities in global trade. For the U.S., the standoff is a stark reminder of how interconnected and fragile modern supply chains are. The crisis also raises questions about America's preparedness for economic conflicts that target isolated regions. Alaska, despite its symbolic importance as a bastion of American independence, is revealing the limits of U.S. self-sufficiency when cut off from its neighbors. As the standoff drags on, the window for a peaceful resolution narrows. Winter's arrival will amplify the consequences of any disruption, turning logistical challenges into humanitarian ones. The longer Trump and Eby cling to their hardline positions, the greater the risk of lasting damage to the U.S. Canada relations and to the lives of those caught in the crossfire. The Alaska highway crisis is no longer just about tariffs or tolls. It's a warning of what happens when trade wars escalate beyond boardrooms and into the real world, where roads close, shelves empty, and communities are left to fend for themselves. The question now is whether either side will blink before it's too late.